Some kinds of silence are gentle, like the hush of dawn, or the pause before a prayer, but some are heavy, the kind that fills a house and presses on the heart. That was the silence Helen lived in. She wasn't always alone. Once her home rang with children's voices, pots clanging in the kitchen, the low hum of evening prayers. Once she mattered to many, but life had a way of thinning things out. One by one, people left. Time moved forward, and Helen stayed. At 72, she had no illusions left. Only a small house in a forgotten neighborhood, a crooked fence, a tired garden, and the company of her thoughts. Her hands, once busy braiding hair and wiping tears, now stitched old clothes for a few coins. Her back ached, her knees creaked, but she kept moving. Not because she had energy, but because stopping meant facing the truth. She had given everything, and now there was no one left to give it to. Her children didn't call. Birthdays passed without messages. Holidays came with silence. They hadn't fought. They hadn't even had a falling out. They had simply outgrown her, or maybe life had swept them too far to remember where they came from. Some days she told herself she was fine. She had her routine, her plants, her Bible. Other days she sat in the same chair for hours just listening. To the wind, the birds, the creak of the stairs. Listening for a knock that never came. Her meals were simple, leftovers. Broths made from bones the butcher gave away. Sometimes neighbors left food by the door. Not because they cared, but because they pitied her. She accepted it with grace. Not because she needed their charity, but because she understood humility. And at night, when the world turned quiet and her heart grew loud, she prayed. Not the kind of prayer with long words and lofty hopes. A simple one. Lord, if there's still something left for me, show me. Not something grand. Just something. A reason to keep hoping. A flicker in the dark. Then one evening, just as the light began to fade into dusk, Helen noticed something unusual. A man sat on the curb just beyond her gate. Still, quiet, watching nothing, wrapped in layers of clothing that looked more like rags than garments. His face was mostly hidden, but what she saw was tired, deeply tired. Not just from walking, but from being alive. People noticed. One man walking his dog shook his head. "Don't let him get too comfortable," he muttered. A woman hurried her kids inside. Helen stood behind her curtain, heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand. Why was he here? Why her street? Why now? She stepped outside. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice firmer than she felt. The man didn't answer. He didn't look up. Just sat. Something in her wanted to turn back, to close the gate, to pretend she hadn't seen. But something deeper, older, held her there. "Are you hungry?" she asked. He gave a small nod. She opened the gate. Her kitchen smelled of garlic and old wood. She reheated the last of her soup, the kind she made from whatever she had. A little potato, a little rice. Nothing fancy, but warm. She didn't set a separate table. She placed the bowl in front of him, then sat across, watching, not with suspicion, but with wonder. He ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. She studied his hands. Large, weathered. His coat had a tear near the collar. His shoes were soaked, mismatched. But he didn't ask for anything more. They said nothing for a long time. When he finished, he whispered, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words. But they sounded like they cost him everything. She offered him the couch, gave him the thicker of her 2 blankets. Before she turned off the lights, she knelt beside her bed. "Lord," she whispered again, "I don't know what this is, but thank you." She slept lightly, listening for footsteps, breathing, any sign of danger, but there was none, only quiet. Morning came with soft light. Birds sang. The kettle whistled, but the couch was empty. The blanket folded, the door shut. He was gone. Helen stood still for a long time, not upset, not relieved, just empty in a different way. Had she dreamt it? Then she saw it. On the table, a small piece of folded paper. No money, no apology, just a note. She unfolded it with fingers that trembled slightly. It said, "Thank you for seeing me. M." Nothing more. No last name, no phone number, no promise to return. Just those few words. But they hit her like thunder, because in all the years she had been fading, No one had said that. No one had seen her. And now, a man with nothing had given her more than anyone with everything. She kept the note on her nightstand, not because she hoped he'd come back, but because it reminded her that she had done something brave. She had opened her door. She had opened her heart. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. Because sometimes, the miracle doesn't look like an answer. Sometimes it looks like a stranger sitting on your curb, and the only thing God is asking is if you'll open the door. Before that night, before the soup and the stranger and the note left behind, Helen's days moved slowly, measured not in hours, but in aches. She lived not just in a house that was forgotten, but in a life that had been reduced bit by bit to leftovers. Leftover fabric scraps she used to patch pants and aprons. Leftover meals made from what others threw away. Leftover time, waiting between sewing jobs that rarely came. But more than anything, Helen lived on the leftovers of love, the fragments of old memories, the echo of voices long gone, the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would remember her one day, not for what she had done, but for who she had been. Her house was small, with a leaking roof and floors that moaned under every step. The paint on the walls had faded from yellow to something like sorrow. A cracked photo frame sat above the mantel, holding the image of a man with kind eyes. Her late husband, Richard. He had passed quietly one winter morning, clutching her hand as if afraid to let go even then. After his death, something in Helen had shifted. Not just grief, but a kind of emptiness that never truly filled again. Her children came for the funeral. They kissed her cheek, cried a little, made promises about calling more. But grief is sticky, and so is distance. Eventually, they stopped calling altogether. Life, as it always does, moved on. She stayed, in the same house, with the same furniture, with the same stories repeating in her head like old songs on a dusty radio. People in the neighborhood called her Miss Helen, always with a tone that mixed pity and polite distance. She wasn't the type to complain, even when her back hurt, even when the power flickered because the bill came late, even when she went 3 days eating nothing but crackers and broth. She never said a word. She stitched clothes during the day, sitting near the window with her sewing machine humming like a tired lullaby. She charged almost nothing, not because she didn't need more, but because she knew most people around her couldn't pay more. And somewhere deep inside, giving something useful made her feel less forgotten. But the truth was, Helen was exhausted, not just physically, emotionally, spiritually. There's a kind of fatigue that sleep doesn't cure, the kind that comes from feeling like your story has already ended, even though your heart keeps beating. At night, she would sit in her old armchair, the one with the floral print worn thin from years of sitting, and whisper prayers. They weren't poetic, just honest. Lord, I'm still here. I don't know why, but I'm still here. Sometimes she cried, not the loud kind, just tears that rolled down silently while her hands stayed folded in her lap. She didn't cry for sympathy. She cried because it was the only thing left to do when nothing else made sense. Her world had shrunk, not by choice, but by time, by loss, by the slow erosion of being overlooked. And yet, despite everything, she still gave. One rainy morning, a neighbor knocked, asking if Helen had any thread for a torn backpack. Helen gave her not only the thread, but sewed the bag herself while the young woman waited. She didn't ask for payment, just smiled and said, "We all need a little help sometimes." When the mailman slipped the wrong letter into her box, Helen walked 5 blocks to deliver it herself, umbrella in hand, shoes soaked through. When a stray cat began sleeping on her porch, she put out scraps of chicken. She didn't like cats much, but something about the way it curled against her doorstep made her feel less alone. She had almost nothing, and yet she gave everything. Because giving, in small and invisible ways, was her only rebellion against the emptiness. That was why when the man sat on her curb, she didn't see danger. She saw herself, someone discarded, someone unseen, and she did what no one had done for her in years. She opened the door. She offered her best. Her last portion of soup, her warmest blanket, her only couch. She didn't do it for reward. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she remembered what it felt like to be hungry, not just for food, but for kindness. And now, days after that man had vanished, she couldn't stop thinking about it, about how his eyes had looked, tired but searching, about how his silence felt less like defiance and more like protection. The note he left, she read it every morning now. Thank you for seeing me. M. That was it. But in a world that passed by quickly, where people stared at phones and not faces, being seen was no small thing. Helen clutched that note as if it were a blessing, as if it were proof that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't faded completely. She didn't know his story, didn't know his name beyond that single initial, didn't know why he came or why he left. But she knew this. Something in her life had shifted, subtly, quietly, but permanently. Because when you've lived on leftovers long enough, even the smallest gesture of presence can feel like a feast. And maybe, just maybe, God had sent that man to show her that she still had something to give, something the world needed. Not money, not answers, but presence, dignity, compassion, and the kind of love that doesn't look for credit. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Sometimes a person doesn't knock on your door. They just appear, quiet, still, as if carried by something older than coincidence. That's how it was with Michael. Helen didn't know his name the first time she saw him. All she saw was a shape on the sidewalk. A man, slouched and unmoving, as if gravity pulled harder on him than on anyone else. His coat was layered with years of dirt and sadness. His hair, matted, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. He didn't speak. He didn't beg. He didn't move. He just sat, as though the curb were the only place left on earth that would hold him. Helen stood behind her lace curtain for nearly 10 minutes, watching. She was used to quiet, used to stillness. But this was different. He wasn't resting. He wasn't waiting. He was sinking. The world had walked past him all day. Neighbors peeked and scoffed. One man shook his head. A woman clutched her purse tighter as she passed. Cars slowed down, then drove on, as if the weight of the man's presence was something to be avoided. But Helen didn't feel fear. She felt recognition. There was something about the way he sat, arms wrapped around his knees, gaze low, motionless, that felt familiar. Not in appearance, in energy. He looked like someone who had given up on being heard, and Helen knew that feeling far too well. So she opened the door, stepped out onto the porch, careful with her knees. "Sir?" she called softly. No answer. She stepped closer, gripping the railing for balance. "Are you hungry?" His head lifted, slow, as if it hurt to move. He didn't speak, just nodded. Barely. She opened the gate, didn't think, just acted. "Come in," she said. Inside, she reheated soup she had saved for herself. Bread, slightly stale, warmed in the oven. Water in a clean glass. A towel folded by the sink. The man sat at her kitchen table, not speaking. His eyes scanned the room like someone remembering what homes used to feel like. She placed the bowl in front of him. He hesitated, then ate, slowly, carefully. She sat across from him, silent, letting the room breathe. After a few minutes, he looked up. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. Helen smiled gently. "You're welcome." They didn't speak again that night. She offered him the couch, gave him a clean blanket, thin but warm, left a pair of socks beside the armrest. Before bed, she prayed, "Lord, I don't know his story, but I know he's yours." The next morning, the couch was empty. He had gone, but the socks were gone too, and in their place, folded neatly on the table, was a note. "Thank you for seeing me. M." No name, no explanation. Helen read it 3 times, then placed it in her Bible. She didn't expect him to come back, but he did. 3 days later, she looked out the window and saw him again. Same sidewalk, same posture, as if he had never left, as if the world had no other place for him. This time, she didn't wait. She opened the door. He looked up, eyes softer, less guarded. "I wasn't sure," he began. "You're welcome," she said before he could finish. Inside, she made tea, toasted bread, served fruit she had been saving. They ate in quiet. Then slowly, pieces of his voice began to return. "My name's Michael," he said. He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask. That night, as rain tapped the windows, he helped wash the dishes, carefully, thoroughly, as if it were sacred. Before sleep, he murmured, "Thank you for trusting me." She replied, "Thank you for coming back." He slept on the floor by the fire, In the morning, he was gone again, but he had left something. Not a note. A single sock, clean and dry, placed on the table with a spoon inside it, as if saying, "I'll return." Helen held it for a long time, not because she needed it, but because it meant she mattered. He returned again the following week, and the next. Each visit, a little longer, a little warmer. They spoke more. Small things, favorite foods, old memories, regrets. He never explained what led him to the streets, only that at some point, it stopped making sense to try. "I wasn't always like this," he said once, staring into the steam of his tea. "I used to have things, a car, a career, even a family. But one by one, I lost them. Or maybe they lost me." Helen didn't pry. Pain shared too soon becomes performance. But she listened, fully, deeply, and that, more than words, healed something. The neighbors talked, whispers of concern, accusations wrapped in smiles. "Are you sure he's safe?" they asked. Helen nodded. "I'm sure." Because she was. Because sometimes what the world calls danger is just someone else's despair. And she had decided long ago. She would rather be wrong about someone's goodness than right about their shame. Each time Michael left, he left something behind. A folded shirt, a washed cup, a new silence, different than before. Not empty, full of presence. And slowly, without realizing it, Helen's house began to change. Not the furniture, the feeling. It was no longer just a space for survival. It was becoming a place of welcome, of grace, of beginning. And though neither of them said it yet, both knew. Something holy had entered their story. There are moments so ordinary they almost slip past unnoticed. A pot on the stove, a spoon resting on a chipped ceramic bowl, the soft hiss of gas and the rising scent of onion and broth. It was all so simple, so quiet. But that evening, it felt like something was shifting. Helen stirred the soup gently. Her hands, firm but tender, moved with the grace of someone who had cooked for others all her life. This wasn't a feast. It was leftover broth from the week before with bits of rice and soft vegetables added in. But she seasoned it with care. Just enough salt. A touch of rosemary. She had no guests in mind. No celebration. Just another evening alone in her kitchen. Until she heard the knock. 3 soft taps on the wood. Hesitant. Almost uncertain. She dried her hands and opened the door. Michael stood there, drenched from the rain. His coat clung to his shoulders. His beard was wet, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like apology. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, voice low. Helen stepped aside without a word. He entered, dripping onto the mat. She handed him a towel, clean, slightly faded, and he wiped his face slowly. "I have soup," she said. He nodded. They didn't talk much at first. She ladled the broth into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. 1 spoon each. A slice of bread between them. She sat across from him and bowed her head slightly. "Thank you, Lord, for this food." It wasn't formal, just familiar. Michael didn't speak, but she saw him close his eyes for a second. A pause. A breath. Then they ate. The soup was hot, fragrant, the kind that doesn't just warm your stomach, but something deeper, something tired in your soul. Helen watched as Michael took slow spoonfuls, careful not to slurp. His hands were steady tonight, less tense. "This is good," he said finally. She smiled. "It's leftovers." He shook his head. "It's more than that." They fell into a rhythm. Spoon, pause, swallow, silence. And in that quiet, something began to unfold. She asked about his coat. It looked older than the rest of him. "Was my father's," he said. "I kept it after he passed." She nodded. "Looks like it's kept you warm." "It has," he said, then added softly, "but not everywhere." He looked up at her. "There's a kind of cold that a coat can't fix." She met his gaze. "I know," she said. The air thickened, but not in discomfort. In truth, they were 2 people who had lived through winters, not just of weather, but of heartache, of being forgotten, of holding on when it would have been easier to let go. After they ate, she offered him tea. He declined gently, saying, "I think I'd fall asleep right here if I got any warmer." So she handed him the blanket, the same one from before. He sat by the fire. She stayed with him. They didn't speak for a while, just watched the flames shift. Helen shared stories, not grand ones, just quiet memories. Of her husband Richard, who used to whistle when he worked in the garden, of her daughter's first piano recital, of the old neighbor who always brought lemons even when no one asked. Michael listened, not out of politeness, out of presence. And then, slowly, he shared. "I used to play guitar," he said. "Wrote songs even." "Really?" "Yeah. Nothing great, but once I played in a church." He smiled. "They let me sing during the offering." Helen imagined him younger, standing on a small stage, guitar in hand, voice trembling but real. "What happened?" she asked gently. He looked down. "I made a lot of bad decisions, trusted the wrong people, broke the trust of the right ones." Helen didn't flinch. "Do you think you're beyond repair?" she asked. He blinked, looked at her. "Sometimes." She leaned back, letting his words settle, then said quietly, "I think we're all a little broken, but God doesn't throw out what's cracked. He just finds new ways to use it." Michael breathed out, almost a laugh. "I hope so," he said. "You're sitting in a house full of cracks," Helen added, "and somehow it's still standing." He smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen on him. That night he slept again by the fire, and Helen, after kneeling beside her bed, prayed once more. "Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for this table, for this soup, and for whatever you're doing in this man's heart." In the morning, Michael was gone, but this time he'd left something behind. 2 folded napkins, each one washed, dried, and ironed. Perfect squares placed beside the sink. Helen picked them up with trembling fingers, not because they were special, but because someone had taken the time to care. Someone who had been cold, someone who had been fed, someone who, despite everything, had remembered kindness. And that was communion. Not bread and wine in a cathedral, but soup and silence in a kitchen, and the whisper of grace in a room where both had once been forgotten. Helen woke before the sun rose. The silence in the house felt colder than usual, a stillness that didn't comfort, but questioned. She sat up slowly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and waited a moment for her breath to steady. Then she walked softly to the living room. The blanket on the couch was folded. The pillow was back in its place. The fire had gone cold, and Michael was gone. No sound of movement, no steam from the kettle, no footprints near the door, just absence. She stood there, letting the truth settle like dust. He had left, not with a goodbye, not even with a note this time, just gone. And it hit harder than she expected, not because she thought he'd stay forever. She wasn't naive, but because something about his presence had filled the space so gently, so completely, that the absence now felt like a wound. She lowered herself slowly onto the couch where he had slept. The fabric was still faintly warm, or maybe she imagined that. She couldn't be sure. Her hands ran along the seam of the cushion as if hoping to find some trace of him left behind. Her eyes stung. It wasn't just Michael. It was everything. Everyone. Richard, her husband, who died in that very house, one slow breath at a time. Her children, who had drifted from her life like mist until all that was left were unanswered calls and empty holidays. Neighbors who used to wave, friends who used to visit. Time had taken them all, or distance had made them strangers. And now Michael, even he, the man with nothing, had left. She whispered aloud, "Of course he did, because that's what people did. They came when they needed something, and they left when they didn't." She sat there for a long time, the morning light creeping slowly across the floorboards. Her thoughts circled back to that soup, that prayer, that moment they had shared near the fire. Was it real? Did it mean anything to him? Had she imagined the warmth in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes? Maybe she had. Loneliness is a trickster. It makes you see things, feel things, hope for things that aren't really there. She stood up and went to the kitchen, made tea with hands that moved slowly, almost mechanically. She didn't drink it right away, just held the mug for warmth. Then something caught her eye, a corner of paper, barely peeking from beneath the bowl on the table. She set the mug down with a soft thud and reached for it. Folded. Small. Her breath caught. She opened it. The handwriting was his. Simple. Sturdy. "Thank you for the light. If you want to know why I came, look here." Below it, an address. No explanation. No signature. Just a name she didn't recognize and a street she barely remembered. Helen read it 3 times as if the meaning would shift. She pressed the paper to her chest, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. A pattern she knew well. A promise that looked like a riddle. A path that asked for faith, not clarity. She sat down and stared at the note again. Was this a goodbye? Or was it something more? She didn't know, but something inside her stirred. Not dread, not grief, but purpose. Later that afternoon, she walked to the corner market, picked up a fresh loaf of bread, smiled at the clerk, walked home slowly, watching the wind play with the leaves. That evening, she lit the lamp in the window again, its light small but unwavering, not because she was waiting for him, but because the act of lighting it reminded her she still had something to give: hope, hospitality, faith. The next morning, she opened her wardrobe, ran her hands over the few dresses that still fit well, chose the one with soft blue flowers, the one Richard always liked, brushed her hair, applied a bit of balm to her lips. She didn't feel younger, but she felt awake. With the note tucked safely in her bag, she stepped outside. The street was quiet. Her shoes tapped softly against the pavement. She didn't know what she would find. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the address led to a memory, or a wound, or a person he had once been. But she needed to go, not because she missed him, but because something about that moment, about that man, had become part of her story now, and she needed to know why. She boarded the bus with calm in her heart, watched the city move past the window, people rushing, honking, shouting, but inside her there was stillness, because she had been empty, and now she was curious, because she had been forgotten, and now someone had remembered her name, because she had been waiting for something, and now she was walking toward it. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a miracle, a quiet one, wrapped in paper, signed with a letter, lit by the kind of love that doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with folded blankets, reheated soup, and a note left by a man who knew what it meant to be seen. The days after Michael disappeared stretched long and heavy. Helen kept the front gate unlatched. She kept the lamp in the window lit. She even prepared an extra bowl of soup each night, just in case. But he didn't come back. No note, no sound, no trace. Only the memory of his presence lingered, like a song that still played faintly after the music stopped. Then, one quiet morning, a car stopped in front of her home. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on her street. Sleek, black, too quiet for something so large. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored gray suit. He adjusted his tie, looked at the number on the gate, and walked with purpose to her door. Helen stood in the doorway, her heart already alert. "Mrs. Helen Whitaker?" he asked. She nodded. "My name is David Langston. I represent Easton and Partners, a private legal firm. I've been asked to deliver something to you personally." Helen hesitated. "Easton?" He gave a polite smile. "May I come in?" Inside, he sat at her kitchen table, so small and aged it looked like it belonged in another century. David opened a leather folder and took out a single envelope and a thin stack of documents. "This may be unexpected," he said gently, "but you've been named as the sole beneficiary of a private estate." Helen blinked. "By who?" "By Michael Easton." Her body went still. She lowered herself into the chair across from him. "I think you must be mistaken," she said. "Michael, he stayed here for a few nights. He didn't have anything." David looked at her with quiet sincerity. Michael Easton was the only son of Robert Easton, founder and CEO of Easton Global Holdings. The estate in question, he slid over a photograph, is located in Lakeview, valued at just over $10 million. Helen stared at the image. A mansion, pale stone, balconies, trees that bent gracefully over a private lake. It looked like something out of a dream, or someone else's life. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be. He left it to you," David said. "It's all legal, all signed. He visited our offices 2 weeks ago, said you were the only one who had ever looked at him like he mattered." Helen's hands trembled. "I don't understand," she said. "He didn't even tell me his last name. He was quiet, gentle. He didn't want anything from me." David nodded. "And that's exactly why he chose you." He pulled out a sealed envelope. "His letter," he said. "To you." Helen took it slowly, opened it, and read, "Helen, if you're holding this, It means I couldn't say it to your face. I didn't know how. I didn't know if I deserved to. But thank you. Not for the soup, not for the couch, for the way you looked at me, for making me feel like someone again. This house, it's yours now. Not because I want to reward you, but because I trust you to do something better with it. You reminded me of the home I once had before money made everything feel empty. You gave me warmth without condition. Please take this gift and make it a home for someone else. I'll be watching from wherever I've wandered off to, and I'll be praying you know how much you mattered to me. Michael. Helen wept. Quietly. Fully. David remained silent. After a while, he placed the deed, keys, and a small leather tag on the table. The tag was old, worn around the edges. Etched into it in Michael's handwriting were just 2 words. For her. Helen picked it up, pressed it to her chest, and breathed deeply for the first time in days. Where is he now? She asked softly. David shook his head. We don't know. He left the city after finalizing everything. No address, no phone, just disappeared. Helen nodded slowly. It made sense. He never stayed in one place for long. He was a man more comfortable in shadows, a man who gave quietly and left before he could be thanked. That night she didn't light the lamp for him. She lit it for what came next. Because this wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. She didn't want a mansion, but she had been entrusted with one. And more than that, she had been entrusted with someone's trust. Michael's trust. God's trust. She stood in her living room, holding the keys, the letter, the memory, and whispered into the stillness, "Use me," because something holy had entered her life, and now it was her turn to open the door. Helen stood at the edge of the massive estate, the keys still in her hand, the letter folded in her coat pocket like something sacred. She had not yet stepped inside. She just stared. The mansion didn't look like a home. It looked like a monument to wealth, to power, to a life she couldn't imagine living. But now it was tied to her name, because Michael had left it for her. And yet, she didn't understand why. Not fully. Not until David returned a few days later with more than just documents. He brought a story. They sat in her kitchen again, just like before. But this time, the silence between them held more weight. "There's something you should know," David said, sliding a slim folder across the table. "You deserve to know who he really was." Helen opened the folder slowly. Inside were pages. Not legal contracts, but fragments of a life, photos, notes, letters, and a name repeated over and over. Robert Easton, Michael's father, one of the wealthiest men in the country, founder of Easton Global Holdings, a billionaire known for cold efficiency, tight control, and a spotless public image. He was born Michael Easton, David began, but he spent most of his life trying to forget that name. Helen ran her hand over a photo of Michael as a boy, maybe 10 years old, dressed in a formal jacket, standing beside a man who stood stiff and unsmiling. He was Robert's only son, David said, but not by marriage. Michael was born out of an affair. His mother, Miriam, was a teacher, quiet, brilliant. She raised him alone until Robert stepped in, claiming legal guardianship for the sake of appearances. Helen kept flipping through the pages, a childhood written in cold images, no birthday cakes, no laughter. He lived in the mansion, yes, David continued, but he wasn't raised in love. He was tolerated, managed, hidden. What happened to his mother? Helen asked. She passed away when Michael was in his early 20s. Cancer, quick. He was devastated. Robert didn't even attend the funeral. Helen's heart clenched. Michael left 3 days later, David said. He walked away from all of it. Didn't take a dollar. Didn't look back. And he stayed gone for nearly 30 years. She looked up. Why didn't anyone look for him? They did, David replied. Briefly. But when he made it clear he didn't want to be found, Robert let him go. The Easton name had to remain spotless. Michael's disappearance was easier to cover than explain. Helen took a breath. So he just lived on the streets? He did more than that, David said. He moved, worked small jobs, slept in shelters, ate in soup kitchens. He said he was looking for something the money had stolen from him. Helen's eyes burned. He told me once, David continued, that dignity isn't something you inherit. It's something someone gives back to you when they treat you like a person again. Helen pressed her hands to her lips. He never told me any of this, she whispered. Because you didn't ask, David said. You saw him. That was enough. Helen stared out the window. The sky had turned gold again, like it had the night he first sat on her sidewalk. Robert died last year, David added. But before he did, he reached out, left a small trust in Michael's name. That's how Michael ended up back in the city. But he refused the money, didn't even open the envelope. She nodded slowly. He didn't want riches, she said. No, David replied. He wanted rest. They sat quietly for a while. Then Helen asked, Where is he now? David looked down. I don't know. After finalizing the deed transfer, he vanished. No calls, no emails, no paper trail. Just gone. Helen nodded again. That sounds like him. But he left something else, David said, pulling a small notebook from his bag. He said you should have this. She opened it. Inside were notes. Not formal. Just thoughts, scribbles, pages of quiet reflection. She didn't ask where I came from, she asked if I was hungry. Maybe love is just hot soup and someone remembering your name. If I die tomorrow, I won't die unknown. I'll die seen. Helen closed the notebook gently, holding it like something breakable. She had seen many kinds of grief in her life, but none like this. This was the grief of someone who had everything once, and still went searching for what truly mattered. She looked down at the keys in her lap. I can't keep this mansion, she said softly. David didn't argue. But maybe, she continued, I can do what he asked. She stood, walked to the window, and watched the sun slip behind the rooftops. I think he wanted this house to become something it never was, she said. A place of welcome. David smiled. Then make it one. Helen turned, her eyes full of tears. I will. And as the evening light faded, she knew Michael hadn't left her a gift. He had entrusted her with a mission. And somewhere, wherever he was still watching, still praying, still grateful. Because what began with a bowl of soup would now become a shelter for stories like his. There are people who feed the hungry with bread, and there are people who feed the soul with something you can't see. Helen had no idea she was doing the latter. She wasn't trying to be extraordinary. She didn't open her door out of pity. She didn't serve that first bowl of soup with the thought of saving anyone. She was just being herself. But that was exactly what made it powerful. Because Michael wasn't looking to be saved. He had long stopped believing that was possible. What he longed for, what he had forgotten how to name, was to be seen. And Helen saw him, not as a burden, not as a lesson, as a person. It had been so long since someone had looked him in the eyes with nothing behind it. No fear, no disgust, no demand, no expectation. Just honest, present attention. The kind of gaze you reserve for people you respect. The first time he sat at her table, he expected her to talk too much, or to ask questions he didn't want to answer. But she didn't. She let silence speak. She let it breathe. And somehow, that made the room feel safe. She asked him if he liked tea. He said yes, even though he hadn't tasted real tea in years. She served it in her best cup. Not a paper one. Not plastic. A ceramic one with flowers on the rim and a tiny chip on the side. That cup mattered more to him than he could explain. Because it meant he was worth something fragile. Something kept. She folded a napkin and placed it beside his bowl. A small act. But one that said, I expect you to sit, to stay, to eat like you belong. He noticed everything. How she warmed the soup twice, just to make sure it wasn't too cold. How she wiped the counter before setting the plate. How she didn't flinch when he coughed or when his hands trembled. She never made him feel like a guest. She made him feel like family. That was the difference. Michael had been in many kitchens, churches, shelters, alleys, but never had he been treated with such quiet honor. She didn't try to fix him. She just made room, and that room made all the difference. One morning, after a night by the fireplace, he woke up to the smell of cinnamon. Helen had baked. Not for a holiday, not for a crowd, just for him. It reminded him of his mother, of mornings long before marble floors and cold boardrooms, long before shame took over his name. He watched her hum while she dusted the windowsill, a melody with no words, a sound of peace, and something inside him cracked open. He didn't cry that morning. He did later, alone, under her sycamore tree out back, the one with the broken bird feeder and the swing that creaked in the wind. He sat there, knees pulled to his chest and cried like a boy who had lost his mother twice. And when he came back in, Helen didn't say a word. She handed him a mug of tea, placed her hand on his shoulder, and sat beside him. He had never felt more human, more real, more whole. He began writing again that week. Not full journals, just scraps of paper, thoughts, memories, prayers. Her kindness doesn't echo. It sinks. It stays. She doesn't look through me. She looks into me. Dignity is a warm chair and no need to explain why your hands shake. He began to help out quietly, sweeping the porch, fixing the latch on the gate, washing his own dishes. Not because she asked, but because when someone believes in your worth, you start to want to live up to it. You start to care again. And that's what happened. Michael began to care. About the tea, about the garden, about his name. He didn't tell Helen who he was. He didn't mention the Easton name. He didn't want to test her kindness. He wanted to rest in it. Because for once it wasn't conditional. He wasn't valuable because of what he owned. He was valuable because she treated him as someone who mattered, simply by being alive. And that changed him more than money ever could. That's what people don't understand. You don't need to build someone a house to restore their soul. Sometimes, all it takes is a clean blanket, a second bowl of soup, a name spoken softly. Helen never tried to change him. She just made it safe for him to remember who he was. And in doing so, she gave him back the one thing he never thought he'd feel again: belonging. The mansion felt impossibly large the first time Helen walked through its front door alone. The ceilings stretched like cathedrals. The walls were lined with portraits of people who had never smiled at her. The furniture was elegant, cold. She stepped carefully as if the house might wake up and ask what she was doing there. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. But she also knew this. She hadn't been given this house to feel comfortable. She had been given it to do something. That's what Michael had meant in his letter. This house is just a building, but maybe you'll turn it into something more. She didn't know how. She didn't know where to start. But she prayed, the way she always had. Honest, tired, and quietly brave. And a thought settled into her chest like it had been waiting there all along. Turn this house into a place for women like you. Women like her. Women who had lived quietly, who had sacrificed, raised children, held families together, buried their dreams beneath casseroles and crises. Women who had prayed for everyone else and been forgotten when they needed prayer themselves. Women who had grown old alone. Women who had given their whole lives and then been left behind. Yes, she knew those women. She was one of them. She walked through the halls with new eyes. She didn't see a mansion anymore. She saw bedrooms waiting to be sanctuaries, a kitchen waiting to hold laughter again, a garden waiting for someone to pull the weeds and plant something living. She didn't start with a plan. She started with a room, the smallest guest room at the end of the west wing. The curtains were stiff. The air was stale. The bed hadn't been touched in years. She opened the windows, stripped the linens, and scrubbed the floor with her own 2 hands. She brought in a chair from the attic, sewed a new cushion, added a blanket she had knitted last winter when the nights were long. Then she made a pot of stew, simple, carrots, potatoes, broth with garlic and thyme. And she waited. She called the same shelter where Michael had once been seen, the same place he had written on the note he left behind. "I'm not looking to rent," she told them. "I'm looking to welcome." The woman on the line was quiet. Then she said, "We have someone." Her name was Teresa, 61, a former nurse, divorced, estranged from her kids, had been living in her car for nearly 8 months. Helen met her at the gate. She wore an old green coat and held a plastic bag full of clothes. Her eyes never stopped moving, like she didn't trust what she was seeing. Helen opened the door wide. "You're safe now," she said. Teresa stepped inside and wept. Helen showed her the room, left her alone for a while, then knocked softly with a tray of soup. That night they sat in the dining room, just the 2 of them. Teresa barely spoke, but she ate, every bite. And when she was done, she said, "Thank you for treating me like I still matter." Helen smiled. "You do." The next day, Teresa helped in the garden. 2 days later, she helped cook. A week later, she welcomed another woman who came through the same door with the same plastic bag and the same haunted eyes. And just like that, the house began to change. It didn't get smaller, but it got warmer. The rooms were no longer quiet. They were full of stories, of grief, of resilience, of beginnings. Helen didn't advertise, she didn't put up signs. But the word spread, and slowly the mansion became what it was never meant to be. A home, a refuge, a holy place for the ones the world forgot. Helen didn't see herself as a savior. She saw herself as a servant. She cooked meals. She listened late into the night. She folded sheets and cleaned bathrooms and prayed over empty beds, asking God to send whoever needed them next. And they came. Each one different. Each one familiar. The house, once filled with gold-framed mirrors and silent hallways, now smelled of stew and cinnamon. It echoed with laughter and healing, and hymn-like silence when someone needed space to cry. One evening, as the sun set behind the old oaks in the yard, Teresa said to Helen, "You could have sold this place. Lived rich for the rest of your life." Helen smiled. "I am living rich," she said, "but not in the way the world counts it." And they sat there together. Two women, two stories, one house that was no longer a mansion, but a miracle. He didn't write. He didn't call. He didn't send a signal or a sign. But Helen had always known somehow that he would return. And when he did, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't announced, it was just a knock at the door. One simple sound that shifted something in the air. She had just finished evening prayer when she heard it. The same lamp still glowed in the front hallway, the one she had lit every night since he'd left. A quiet promise that the door would always be open. And now, it was. She opened it slowly, and there he stood. Michael. Different but familiar. He was clean now, his coat new, his eyes clearer, his face fuller. But something in him, deep beneath the surface, still carried a weight, a silence, a fracture that hadn't fully healed. He looked at her and tried to speak. He couldn't. So she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. No words, just warmth, and the kind of welcome you don't need to earn. He trembled, not from cold, but from being seen. Again. She brought him inside, led him to the same chair where he'd once sat in silence, spooning soup with hands that shook. She poured him tea, lemon the way he liked, and sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was filled now, with life, with laughter, with second chances. Michael took a breath and finally said, "You kept the light on." "I never turned it off," she replied. He looked around. "I almost didn't come, but you did. I was ashamed. You were human. I left without saying goodbye. You came back, that's better." His eyes watered. "I'm still not whole." Helen nodded. "No one here is." He smiled through the tears. "I went back," he said, "to the places I left. I saw the estate from a distance. I stood outside the old church where my mother sang. I even talked to a man who once told me I was a waste of a name." Helen waited. "I didn't go for closure," he said. "I went to forgive. Not for them. For me." He paused. "And when I had nothing left to say, I remembered this place. You." He sipped his tea. "I thought maybe, if you still remembered me, maybe I could believe I still mattered." Helen leaned forward. "You mattered, before you ever said a word." He looked at her, then down. "Thank you for feeding me. Always. Thank you for not asking questions. I asked the ones that mattered. Thank you for not fixing me. You weren't broken, just bruised." He laughed quietly. "Still am." "Good," she said. "Only bruised things remind us we're still alive." Later, she showed him around. The rooms were full now. Women folding laundry, kneading dough, sitting in circles with yarn and stories and warm hands. He saw them, and they saw him. No one asked who he was. They just smiled, nodded, included him. He stayed for dinner, at a long table where no one sat in silence unless they wanted to. He didn't speak much, but when Helen asked him if he'd like to say grace, he nodded. "God," he said, "thank you for the meals we don't deserve but need. Thank you for the doors that stay open. And thank you for soup served with love." No one clapped, but everyone bowed their heads a little longer. That night, as he stood at the door to leave, Helen handed him a folded blanket. "You still wander?" she asked. He nodded. "Sometimes." She handed him a bag with bread and tea and 2 pairs of socks. "In case you forget you're still cared for." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Am I allowed to come back?" Helen smiled. You never really left. And as he stepped out into the night, the porch light glowing behind him, Michael knew home wasn't a place he had lost. It was something someone had saved for him. Light on, door open, heart ready, always. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it grows where silence once lived. Sometimes it's born from what was broken. That's how it was with Helen and Michael. What began as a shared moment over soup became a thread that stretched across time, distance, silence, and return. It wasn't predictable. It wasn't even intentional. But it was real. After Michael came back to the house, that first time, he didn't stay forever. Not at first. He returned often, then disappeared again. No explanation, no pattern, but always back. Always to the same door, the same tea, the same lamp left on. Each time, Helen welcomed him like she had on that very first night. Not with questions, but with presence. He fixed what was broken around the house. A loose step, a leaking faucet, a cracked drawer in the pantry. Quiet work, kind work. The kind of tasks that required hands that remembered how to give. He never tried to take up space, but she made space anyway. Every time. And somewhere between the repairs and the prayers, the peeling carrots and mending hems, something deeper began to stir between them. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't romantic in the way stories tell you to expect. It was rooted, like an old tree. It started when he began bringing things, little things. A book he thought she might like, a pair of garden gloves, a flower he found on a trail beyond town. Once, he brought a hand-carved spoon, said nothing, just left it by her teacup. She noticed. She always did. In return, she saved the best seat for him at the table, the one with the cushion that didn't wobble, the one with a view of the garden. And when she baked bread, she always sliced the crust end for him, the part most people left, the part he liked best. They shared routines without naming them. Morning coffee, evening walks, silent prayers. One day, in the middle of pulling weeds, Helen felt his hand gently brush hers. She didn't pull away. Their fingers touched just long enough to say everything they hadn't yet found words for. He looked up. She met his eyes. Nothing said. Everything understood. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, they sat by the fireplace. She handed him a small notebook. Empty pages, a pen tied to the side. "For the things you still haven't told anyone," she said. He nodded. "Will you read them?" "Only if you want me to." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I think I do." They didn't talk about love, but it lived in the pauses. The kind of pauses that were warm, not empty. He began staying longer, sometimes a night, sometimes a week. The other women in the house started calling him by name, started saving a bowl for him at dinner, started praying with him in the mornings. It didn't feel like he was visiting anymore. It felt like he belonged. And one night, under a sky so clear the stars looked like breath, he asked her, "How do you know when something is love?" Helen thought for a moment, then said, "When it keeps showing up, even after all the reasons it could have stayed away." He nodded slowly. "I think I've been showing up for a long time." She smiled. "I know." And then, without hesitation, he reached for her hand and held it, firmly, fully, not as a question, as an answer. It was not a beginning. It was a continuation of grace, of trust, of a kind of love that didn't arrive to fix the past, but to walk with it into a softer future. They never called it a relationship. They didn't need to, because what they had was truer than titles. It was the miracle that happens when two people, shaped by silence, allow themselves to be heard again, in the language of touch, of presence, of shared breath. And in that quiet, holy space between healing and hope, something unthinkable bloomed. Love, not loud, but unshakable. Helen had always believed in miracles, but never the kind that came in packages, never the kind you could touch or spend. Her miracles were softer, quieter, the kind that came in moments no one else noticed. A neighbor's unexpected smile, a sunrise that felt like a hug, a single hot meal on a cold night. She didn't ask for more than that. Not after everything, not after the loneliness, not after the years of silence from the ones she loved most, not after the seasons when her name stopped appearing on birthday invitations, when the phone stopped ringing, when even her prayers started to feel like echoes. But still, she prayed, "Lord, if there's still something for me, if I'm not done yet, show me." And the answer came wrapped in simplicity. A knock at the door, a man with tired eyes and no expectations, and a single bowl of soup. That was all it took. Not to change everything at once, but to begin something holy. Because Helen didn't just open her door, she opened her heart. And from that day on, everything began to shift. The mansion came after. Unexpected, unimaginable, unrequested. She didn't see it as a prize. She saw it as a question. What will you do with what you've been given? She knew the answer immediately. She would give it away. Not in pieces, not for profit. She would give it by filling it. With people, with purpose, with stories that the world had forgotten but God had not. So she cleaned it, opened it, prayed through every hallway. And then she waited. And one by one, they came. Women like her. Women who had spent years taking care of everyone else and now had no one left to ask, "Are you okay?" Women who had carried families, held grief in their bodies, smiled through heartbreaks. Women who had outlived their usefulness, or so they thought, and were now just names on dusty records, worn shoes on unfamiliar streets. Helen didn't fix them. She welcomed them. She listened. She cooked. She made space. And in return, the mansion began to change. What once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with life. Soft laughter, prayer before dinner, hands folding laundry and planting flowers. A chorus of healing built from whispered stories and broken rhythms. And Helen? She became something more than she had ever been before. She wasn't just a host. She was a witness, a caretaker of grace, a living example of what it means to answer the door when no one else will. When Michael returned, it wasn't to reclaim anything. It was to remember, to honor, to say thank you, not just to Helen, but to the life that had been born from his absence. He found love there, not loud, not public, but constant, faithful, love that remembered, love that forgave, love that said, "I see you, even now, especially now." And in that sacred space between what had been lost and what had been found, Helen saw the truth unfold. She had not been rewarded. She had been entrusted. And her yes, her single, ordinary, trembling yes, had turned an abandoned estate into a place where the forgotten found their names again. The miracle wasn't in the value of the house. It was in the value of the people who walked through its doors, and the God who had never once left her side, even when she had felt invisible, even when she had stopped believing she could still be used, even when all she had was a prayer and a pot of soup. He had been working, waiting, preparing something she couldn't have imagined, not because she deserved it, but because she said yes to being faithful in the small things. And in return, he restored her, with peace, with purpose, with people, with a home that didn't just belong to her, but to every story it now sheltered. That's the real miracle, not what God gives, but what he does through what we give back. And Helen, she gave everything, not because she had to, but because love, when it's real, always has more to pour. Helen didn't receive a reward. She received a reason. And through that reason she found what she had been missing all along. Not a house, but a home. Not comfort, but calling. Not silence, but song. Her story reminds us that even the quietest yes can change everything. That dignity isn't given. It's remembered. And that love, when it comes through the back door, still carries the full weight of heaven. And if that moved something in you, if part of you remembered what it feels like to be seen, to be chosen, to be useful again, then the next story will take you even deeper. It starts in another house, not with a widow, but with a maid, invisible, present, and suddenly, carrying more than just secrets, she becomes pregnant. The father, her billionaire employer, what he does next will change everything, in every possible way. Watch now. A maid becomes pregnant by her billionaire boss. What he did next, no one expected.